Welcome to the Environmental Transformation Podcast, where we bring you interviews with industry leaders, climate champions, sustainability practitioners, EHS and hazmat professionals making an impact in their businesses today. Each leader solving complex challenges and delivering solutions within their areas of expertise. I'm your host, Sean Grady, and thanks for joining us today. Before we jump in, make sure to follow us on your devices and visit my website at www.seankgrady.com and sign up for our newsletter and email announcements. Now let's get started. Welcome to the Environmental Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Grady, and today's guest is Robert Wilkinson. Robert has over 25 years experience in the environmental investigation, assessment, remediation, compliance, and management field. He is a CHMM, but he's also a licensed geologist in the state of Tennessee. His current role is the CCR Technical Manager for TDEC's Bureau of Environment. Robert is responsible for the investigation, assessment, and remediation of environmental impacts resulting from the management and disposal of CCR at TVA coal-fired power plants in Tennessee. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here and talk a little coal ash with you.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how you got started.
I started out after I got out of college in the environmental field. I actually started in college. I was a driller in Texas. I was helping all the grad students drill monitoring wells. Is how I cut my teeth in the environmental industry. And got out and worked for the university system there at A&M for a couple of years, continuing on as a researcher, and then eventually got into consulting. Spent several years, almost 15 years as a consultant, and then switched over here to TDEC about a little over 7 years ago. They asked me to come on board to help them with their CCR issues here. Having never worked with CCR before, I don't know why they asked me to do that for them. But I was actually applying for a different job with TDEC. I was trying to get into their corrective action program over in their UST sector. And after a couple interviews, I think they figured I was underqualified for that. So they said, maybe you could handle CCR for us. Yeah. So that's what I ended up doing.
Wow. So. Hey, they probably recognize you were a consultant and you've had that experience in the past, and you could probably help work with the third parties or the other consultants that are doing this work.
Yeah, they were really looking for someone to come in and take a program that was in its kind of infancy stages and needed to work with a single entity here in Tennessee. We only work with Tennessee Valley Authority. That's the only power provider we have here. And being a big organization, they were also looking for someone who hadn't actually worked for TVA in the past, which I hadn't. I was a unicorn in that respect. So
you're like, hey, we found somebody.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, we found someone who hasn't actually worked with TVA that lives here. So yeah, let's bring them on board. But yeah, so it's CCR, the investigation and the assessment. That's all my background is, really going in and doing a full characterization of a site and determining what the potential impacts are to the environment, assessing those impacts, and coming up with a strategy to take care of them. And that's really why they wanted me to come on board and work with TVA on that one.
That's great. That's good to hear. There's been a lot of recent updates and new rule updates for the coal combustion residual waste disposal program management program, the rule, should I say. Let's talk about the history a little bit for those who aren't familiar with CCR and the EPA rulemaking process, because there's probably a few people that are maybe listening and go, wow, I haven't really thought about this topic much or even know about it. So you maybe talk about what triggered the EPA to establish the disposal of CCR rules and that's affected the electric utilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I always like to start with, when we're talking about CCR, which are coal combustion residuals, we're using a very specific term, a very legal regulatory term, is CCR. We have coal ash, which is basically what CCR is. It's coal ash. It's what comes out of the process after you burn coal through a boiler to make steam to generate power. Yep. But to be a CCR, you have to do it for power generation for the grid. It's not power generation at a local plant that may be having their own coal ash fired boilers that's producing steam for either a chemical process, or they may be even producing a small amount of their own power. It's for only that kind of stuff that was sold to the grid. The federal rule is very specific to that. They didn't want to interfere with places that may be using coal-fired boilers for other uses. They really wanted to focus on power generation for the grid. And that kind of stems from, in Tennessee, we are actually ground zero for why we have federal coal ash regulations. And that's because in In 2008, there was a catastrophic release at TVA's Kingston power plant on the Clinch River. Hundreds of millions of gallons of ash was released from a surface impoundment. We had a dike failure there that ended up impacting a lot of the Clinch River and a lot of local properties around there. So it was a major environmental issue, almost you would say a disaster, right?
Yeah,
It was a
I
big deal.
remember.
Yeah. And at that point, coal ash had not been regulated. It was exempted under the Bevel exemption as being not a hazardous waste, right? So it was basically just a disposed of in surface impoundments or in some landfills, and really didn't have any regulations for the surface impoundments. If you had a CCR landfill, you were probably regulated in your state under your state's RECRA program, but there was nothing at the federal level at that time in 2008 when this occurred. And that's what spurred the EPA to develop the regulations, and they were eventually put out after a lot of public comment and back and forth. And they were pretty unique in that they were originally written to be self-implementing rules. That
Uh-huh.
means EPA was not going to enforce the federal CCR rule at the federal level when they came out in 2015. They were going to leave it up to the regulated entity to demonstrate compliance with those rules through certified engineering documents, through things they posted on their website for the public to consume and for EPA to ultimately review as well. So it was very
Mhm.
much an interesting way to it's compliance through, we're honest, we're complying,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
and but at the time there wasn't any money in the federal budget to actually enforce these rules once they put
Yeah.
them out. So that's the way they went with it. They had a no appropriations.
Well,
So yeah.
I gotta imagine too, Robert, the rule being from a self-implementing perspective, I would imagine it's a pretty daunting task for a utility to come up with the funds to to address the rule requirements as well. And so it leads me to like a big question is what are the basic elements of the CCR rule that has caused this kind of concern in the industry, the unfunded mandate, so to speak, of this type of new rule? Talk about that. I think this will be important to understand for the listener.
Yeah, absolutely. The big thing that the federal CCR rule was doing, number one, they were trying to reduce the risk of a Kingston happening again, right? They wanted to ensure that the disposal of coal ash was done in a way that it was structurally stable, that it was protective of groundwater, surface water, and the environment, the way it was being managed,
Right.
that it had proper liner designs for the unit, that it was not located in an environmentally sensitive area, right? You wanted to make sure you weren't, near wetlands. You weren't in a seismic zone that may have an issue with earthquakes affecting your stability. Didn't want it to be in a karst environment where you could have dropouts and this material enter the groundwater. And they also wanted to establish a set of operating criteria, right? There was no industry standard for how you handled coal ash, right? It was pretty much however the power plant had been doing it for the last 50 years.
Right.
So they
Right.
wanted to establish how we're going to manage coal ash as well. Record keeping, there were no record keeping requirements. You didn't have to know how much coal ash you had, where you had disposed of it as. It was just, oh, that's our pond over there. And then we used to have a pond over here where we dispose of it. And we got a landfill back here on this side. But there were no real record keeping requirements. And then finally, even in 2015, the industry was starting to move away from coal as a power source, moving to natural gas, moving to renewables, moving to other forms of power generation. And they wanted to make sure that the operators were closing them properly and closing them in a way that was protective of the environment. So, and then eventually, as the rule developed in 2016, EPA did get money and authorization through the WIN Act to develop its own permitting program, which it's been doing since 2016. So they were encouraging states to adopt the federal rules and start doing the implementation of the program as well. So you have the state program now come into what the federal CCR rule was. And then, of course, we've got some new stuff coming up this year about inactive units and coming up in November that's supposed to change the landscape quite a bit. And so it's been a very evolving program. It's been a very litigated program. There's been multiple lawsuits filed on behalf of NGOs, on behalf of the industry, on behalf of states. Everybody's had their hand raised and go, we've got this problem with it as they started going through this. So it's definitely an evolving, but the core thing about it is how are we going to manage coal ash, ensure it's properly and safely disposed of to where we don't have anything like Kingston happen again in the future.
How many landfills or impoundments of CCR are out there that we know of?
Some of the best numbers we have actually go back to 2015. And at the time when 2015, when they were implementing the rule, there were about 300 active landfills, CCR landfills in the US, and about a little over 700 surface impoundments that were active at the time. The new numbers, there's not really a clearinghouse for it. A lot of those units have closed since then. And the number of inactive units are still being inventoried, right? There is a lot of units that in 2015 and have been closed since the 60s, 70s, people not really sure how they were closed or where they were closed or where we might have put that. Power plants come, power plants go. But our best guess is, like I said, right around that 300 landfills, 700 surface impoundments. But that number is going down as we start to close coal power plants. We're starting to have those drop off. We have here in Tennessee, we've got 8 different coal powered power plants that have anywhere from 30 to 34 units total here in Tennessee. But there's other states that have way higher numbers than we do. A lot more players in the power game and a lot more units that they have to address.
Hello, ET Nation. I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy the interviews we bring you, please consider supporting the program by visiting my website at SeanKGrady.com and buy me a cup of coffee. Proceeds will go towards helping me continue producing timely content and offsetting production costs. I'd also like to take a moment and recognize a few of our sponsors of the show who have been amazing partners and who are ET Nation legends. If you're looking for a driller and an environmental contracting firm to help you delineate the extent of contamination at your site, then look no further than Cascade Environmental. Cascade has over 37 offices across the country and offers a huge range of environmental and geotechnical drilling, site characterization, and remediation services. With their huge fleet of equipment and nationwide coverage, Cascade is a great choice to support your environmental and infrastructure needs. To learn more about their company, visit their website at cascade-env.com. That's cascade-env.com. I'd also like to give a shout out to Enthalpy Analytical. If you're looking for a single source for all your laboratory testing services, then give Enthalpy Analytical a call. With their network of accredited laboratories, experienced project managers, chemists, and industry professionals, they have everything you need to support your next project. They can analyze anything from drinking water, groundwater, soil, sediment, sludge, air, and much more. To learn more about Enthalpy Analytical, visit their website at enthalpy.com. That's enthalpy.com. Finally, I'd like to recognize Zappa Stewart, the leading provider of superabsorbent polymer technology for the power, dredging, oil and gas, and remediation sectors for over 20 years. When a reliable, fast, and cost-effective liquid waste solidification solution is needed, customers count on Zappa Stewart's brand of SAPs and technical expertise. When liquid waste needs to be out of sight and out of mind, give Zappa Stewart a call. To learn more about Zappa Stewart, go to my website at SeanKGrady.com. That's SeanKGrady.com. Now, let's dive back into this interview. If we could, for the listeners, it might be interested to talk about what are some of the chemicals and concerns associated with CCR and what is the rule doing to protect human health and the environment in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. We have what we call our chemicals of concerns, our COCs and we like to refer to them as the CCR parameters here in Tennessee. And we look at a whole suite of metals. Your metals are your real drivers here when it comes to what could potentially leach out of these units and affect groundwater and affect surface water. And most of the carbons and the things like that get burned off as part of the combustion process.
Right.
We don't have a lot of concerns about that. What we're really looking for is, and these are like the big ones, the ones we've seen pop up most. We have arsenic has a lot of high concentrations in there, in both arsenic 3 and arsenic 4, getting down for the chemistry nerds there. You want to talk about how they diffuse out and leach out and everything like that.
Yeah.
But we also have things like molybdenum, lithium, cobalt, some selenium in there as well. There's also radium is in there as well that is of a concern with those chemicals and with those particular metals that are associated with it. And the list goes down. We look at, I don't know if I mentioned molybdenum as one of the ones we look at, but there's a whole suite of them. But the real kind of culprits that we see, at least in my experience here, the arsenics, the lithiums, and the cobalts tend to be the ones that we see leaching out of these units whenever we do have impacts to groundwater, especially.
Okay. That's good to know. When you talk about the need for say, dewatering surface impoundments. Why is that so important? Because that seems to be a major activity in managing these surface impoundments and protecting water quality and things like that. So talk a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, it's once you get to a point where you're trying to close these units, and under the federal rule, you've only got really two choices of how you're going to close them. If you've determined that you have to close these units because they're not compliant with the federal CCR rule, you've either got to do what's called a closure by removal, where you dig up all this material and put it into a lined landfill for disposal.
Mhm.
Or if you can demonstrate that you can close it in place safely with a capping system, you can do it that way. But either one of those components, when it comes down to closing one of these units, you've got to get rid of all the water that you can out of it, right? You've got to get these are surface impoundments. They were ponds. They still retain water the way a pond would, whether it's rainwater, even if they're no longer having ash sluiced to them as part of the process. That's what they're there for, is to retain water. You've got to do a lot with making sure you get rid of all the free water that is sitting there on top of the unit that may have been there for years. And then we have what's called pore water, or entrained water that's actually within the matrix of the coal ash. You can think of coal ash as having very similar qualities of like silts and clays and soils and stuff like that. It retains water, it likes to hold water. So whenever we close these units, we've got to take care of all this water that's sitting on the top. We've got to decant that off, and then we've got to do our best to pump and get rid of the rest of the water for one of two reasons. Three reasons, actually. Number one, eliminating water is going to eliminate head that may be contributing to groundwater contamination. So we want to get that head pressure out of there. And then the other two are for the stability of closure. Whether we are going through the process of taking this material to a landfill, we've got to get the water off of it so it'll be conditioned properly. It can be loaded for transport and it can eventually be placed at the landfill. And then if we're going to close in place, we've got to have a stable surface to cap these units with. And so
Mhm.
with that, we've got to get that water out of there. And EPA has a lot of concerns about when you close in place, making sure that you are no longer in contact with the groundwater. And one of the ways we ensure that is by eliminating water from the unit, making sure we don't have any water recharge back into the unit that's going to cause it to become saturated again. And a liner is the most effective way to do that, but also geology itself can help with that process. But it's really about getting this unit in a condition where it's no longer going to either cause more condition of pollution in the environment, and it's going to be stable enough to either be hauled off and placed in a landfill or put a cap on it.
So the cost to a utility for managing this water, I would imagine, is quite steep at times, right? Like, where are they taking the water if they are pumping it off? They probably just can't discharge it directly to a stream, or they probably have to send to a wastewater facility, or what?
That's actually there's several options with it. And a lot of these units had, since they were water treatment units, did have an NPDES discharge with them, but you can't discharge the concentrations once it's no longer serving a treatment purpose. You no longer have the flows through there. You've got this concentration of constituents in the water. If you want to discharge it, you've got to treat it right. You've got to set up some type of wastewater treatment that's going to get the water back down to where you can legally discharge it within the limits of your permit. Or you're going to have to do what you talked about, where you've got to containerize it. You've got to ship it out for treatment. You've got to send it maybe to the local POTW for treatment as well. There's several options to do with it. Here in Tennessee, we've got a couple of sites that we've got some pretty extensive treatment systems that TVA has installed to make sure that any of the water that they're pumping out of these units, it's getting filtered, it's getting settled, it's getting sent through sand packs, it's getting sent through all of the right kind of stuff to get it down to those low levels where it can be safely discharged. And
One option, Rob, that I've heard about, and I know the company I work for is involved with in helping utilities, is installing and permitting deep well injection wells, so we can just discharge that water into an aquifer a mile or so deep in the ground.
Yeah, that one I've heard of how that's being kicked around. We haven't had any chance to work with that in Tennessee yet. We're lucky in that most of our units are located adjacent to rather large water bodies. They still have their NPDES permit. We can treat the water. I always want to make sure the key element is, before we do that deep well injection, before we do that discharge of any kind, is that we've done some type of treatment on it to get it to where it's not going to cause a condition of pollution anywhere, any way, shape, or form. And I think deep well injection is something that is coming out there. on the market. Deep well injection has been done in oil field. It's been done in several different treatment methodologies.
As waste industry and
As waste industry, right? Yeah, we've done it for years. And I think as long as you're doing that work to get to that point to where you've got the data to show you're not going to create a condition of pollution, there's definitely some options for it. We haven't had any that have had to go to a treatment facility. We've had fairly manageable levels of these constituents in the water that we've been pumping out so far. And so or TVA has been pumping out. I just see the data on it as the regulator. I just see the data as it comes in. I'm making sure they're staying compliant with their permit requirements. But they've established some really good effective treatment systems for it, and being able to process large volumes. I think that's the key, right? Is especially if you're doing a closure operation, you can generate hundreds of millions of gallons of water out of this process, because you're not only treating what was there in the first place, but if you're doing a closure by removal, you've got to treat every bit of stormwater that comes in contact with the CCR. That's just, and you're in a rainy part of the country, you're in the wet season, you're just going to be sitting there generating, like I said, hundreds of millions of gallons of this stuff to be treated.
Yeah. That's what I think some of these utilities are thinking. This deep well injection options is a pretty attractive from a cost management perspective. I think it's another tool in the arsenal, so to speak, of effectively managing impoundment water, processed water.
And that cost, of course, that's always a concern, because that gets passed down to your ratepayers. That gets passed down to the community that the power plants have been supporting and everything else. So you have to be good stewards of those costs as well. And I think that's a great point, Sean, is how that could be a cost-effective option for that.
Sure. What do you think some of the biggest challenges utilities are facing complying with the recent new rule addressing inactive surface impoundments and inactive electric utilities?
Yeah, that's first off, I think that here recently in the last month, there's been at least 2 or 3 lawsuits that have been filed challenging, challenging that particular rule. And it does expand the universe quite widely. In Tennessee, we were already looking at these with TVA as part of our commissioner's order that we have in place. TVA was evaluating whether 2015 was the cutoff, right? If you weren't using it at that 2015 rule date, it wasn't included in the federal rule.
Right.
Now we're looking at EPA's looking at trying to go back and say, you've got, even if it was already closed, as long as it was on your site, active or inactive, whatever the status might be, that you've got to address it. And I will say that through our commissioner's order process here in Tennessee, we have identified impacts to the environment from these old closed units.
Okay.
And I think the logic of addressing those is definitely something that needs to be considered. We considered it in Tennessee when we started doing our order process. We realized that regardless of whether the federal government decided they wanted to go and take a look at these closed units, that we had a high potential of those units, considering their age and what the regulatory standards were during the closure of those, where there were no regulatory standards, to be quite frank, in some of them, that we may need to just address them. And then you have the issue of this: if these sites have multiple units, whether active or inactive, commingling of plumes, and one unit is impacting the groundwater that's flowing under the other units, using those tools to determine really where the impacts are and addressing those. And with TDEC and TVA was definitely on board with it early in the process. They wanted to have that understanding. They're very good stewards of their environment, right? And they wanted to know, are there potential impacts from those old units? Now, I'm not really sure how things are going to play out in federal space, because I've heard good arguments on both sides about the challenges to these rules. I think we're in a state. I think the biggest challenge is going to be, what's the final rule going to look like? Because I don't know if what is set to kick off here in early November is what the final rule will look like after litigation. So I think the uncertainty that the industry is facing right now is a huge challenge, right? We try to give, as the regulatory agency in Tennessee, TDEC tries to do our best to give as much certainty as we can. And that's why when we started the process, we're like, look, let's address all of these, whether or not the EPA gets there or not. This is going to give you a level of comfort as the regulated entity, that we're not going to come back later and start adding sites 10 years down the road, right? Let's take a look.
Hey, we're going to reopen all these sites that have been closed or inactive. Maybe it might make more sense to do an assessment of these known identified impoundments to see if they actually have any issues instead of just making them do work when there's
Right.
no issue. I think that'd be a more logical approach if that's a viable.
And that's exactly what we did here is we're like, look, we're doing these investigations on these sites anyway for these landfills and these impoundments that you're currently using. It wouldn't be a big stretch for us to go ahead and assess these other ones and help you guys identify if there's any problems right now instead of being 10 years down the line and realizing you have to go back and do something and redo those investigations and redo that work that's already been done.
Mhm.
And I think it's helped position Tennessee to I like to brag and say Tennessee's the leader in what we're trying to do with investigating assessing CCR. And I truly believe it's because some of the foresight, even that predated my tenure here, the folks that were here before me that were putting this order together and what they wanted to assess were had a I don't know, they had good crystal balls, way better than mine about looking into the future and seeing what could be an issue. So I think that gave some certainty to the process. And I think that's what the rest of the country is struggling with these new rules is this is a game changer and this kind of changes the regulatory landscape and it throws a curveball at you. So
Yeah,
that's
right.
yeah,
That's
and as well as I do, uncertainty leads to costs when it comes to
yeah,
environmental compliance.
right,
Yeah.
because no one's real certain what should I be focusing on, and you could go down a rabbit hole pretty quick and realize, "Oh, that's wasn't a big as important as we thought." Is TDEC authorized by the EPA to manage the program and issue permits, or does it have to go through EPA approval too?
We're still going through the process of developing a rule program. We treat landfills in Tennessee, CCR landfills, as what we call class two industrial landfills. So all of the landfills that are active in Tennessee have a permit, and there's several closed ones that were permitted and entered closure phase. So
Mhm.
we've been the regulatory authority on the landfills. We adopted the commissioner's order and did the work under it for the surface impoundments and we have been evaluating those under the commissioner's order. But what we're doing right now is we are working with EPA to start the process of submitting a rule package to them for them to review and provide feedback on. We're still in the early stages of it. It takes a while to do all the things you have to do where you have to maybe have
Yeah.
to change some statute. You've got to write the rule package.
Yeah,
You've got to
rulemaking
do
is
the
not an easy process.
it's not. As coming from the consulting side of things, and I came to the state, I was like, "Oh man, oh yeah, I can write rules. Sure, I've read rules my whole career. Yeah, writing rules is way different than reading rules. So I will say that. But so we don't have designated authority from the EPA yet, but we are working towards that in Tennessee.
Gotcha. Are you aware of different states that are out there that do have it?
Yeah, yeah, there's quite a few programs that have been approved. Georgia here in Region 4 has an approved program. Texas has an approved CCR program. Oklahoma has an approved program. There's a few other states that have got delegated authority. There's several states that have said they're not going to seek delegated authority. And there's been a couple of high profile denials that the EPA has issued for programs as well. But I think everybody would the states want to be doing this. We want to be regulating
Yeah.
coal ash within our borders. And there's some that are just like we don't have but one coal-fired power plant, and it closed 20 years ago. So no, we don't have any interest in getting involved in that particular enforcement. But
Does the state have input or first look at some of these draft rules with EPA? Do they reach out for your guys' opinion on things? Like TVA is like the biggest entity. Why don't do they even ask for TDEC's thoughts or opinions on this?
we regularly work with the federal government, the
Okay.
EPA, on we engage with them in working groups and things like that. We don't. We're the rulemaking process at the federal level is very much it's up to EPA to look at what the legislation says and how they're going to develop rules to comply with the legislation. We don't get a special preview at the state. We see it when it comes out for public comment, just like
Right.
everybody else.
Okay.
And we do review those packages and we provide comments back to EPA through that process. And it's also to make sure that it's a very open and public process. EPA's doing what they're going to do. They're going to put it out to the entire public for comment and then the public is going to see what the state has to say about that as well. It's a very useful tool to keep things very open and out in the public view whenever we do interact on those. We EPA lets us know that they give us their priorities every year, of course, with regards to what they may be working on and things like that, but we don't get an opportunity to really start engaging until those rules are made public.
So with this latest update to the orphan type inactive sites, surface impoundments and landfills, are you guys going to be like at a standstill until some of this gets resolved in the courts with some of the lawsuits, or are you going to continue pushing forward with the approach with some of the utilities? What do you think that'll look like?
Some states, I believe it'll give pause to. In Tennessee, what we're doing with our rule package, we're still in the development process, still writing the rules. So we're going to have the opportunity to make changes as these things get sorted out. So I think we continue full steam ahead with our process and what we're trying to do. I always say we have our order in place, which we're doing the work under currently. That's not going anywhere. We're going to continue to complete these investigations, make these corrective action determinations, and move forward with them through that space. But we keep a close eye on what comes out. We keep a close eye on the decisions. I have lawyers that do that for me. I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV
Sure.
kind of thing. I get my information and let them know. And of course, through the rulemaking process, you have to have those kind of folks that are looking over your shoulder doing that and making sure that you color
Sure.
within the particular lines. So no, we're gonna continue to move forward with it. We're gonna work through the process, and we're hopefully gonna get to a point where we've got a delegated program from EPA.
So I was reading through as I was doing a little research on this topic, and one of the things I noticed was that there is an option, I think, for utility to do some sort of a performance validation of an existing landfill, even though the requirement is to have a lined landfill. But if they could demonstrate that the existing design and the conditions of the landfill aren't leaking, and it will be protective if they have appropriate cover, they don't need to go through the steps of actually putting in an actual subtitle D liner system on a system. Is that correct?
They do have what they call an alternative liner standard in
Yep.
the rules. It's basically you have to be able to demonstrate that the what we consider would be the uppermost component of the liner in a recre landfill. It'd be HDPE, 60 mil, that kind of stuff. All of these leachate collection system, geologic buffer, clay placement. What you have to be able to demonstrate is that the material that you have at the base of these landfills has enough strength and consistency, and that it must be good compacted clay type soil that is going to prevent the migration of contaminants into the groundwater. So there is a way to demonstrate that. To be honest, I haven't had anybody successfully that I've seen do that. And if anybody's listening and they have, I'd love for somebody to shoot me an email and go,
Hey.
"Oh yeah, we did it in X state when we were able to do that." Because it is a pretty stringent standard, and it's basically you would have had to do some type of subgrade preparation, right, to meet these kind of geotechnical requirements for the 10 to the minus seventh transmissivity and that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
compaction wise.
Yeah, compaction and everything else, right? So it's definitely there. It's an option. A lot of whenever you don't do a constructed base on your landfill, you end up with inconsistencies and ununiformities and things like that. So it's very difficult to demonstrate that, but it is possible. And like I said, if anybody else has heard of somebody being able to do it, I haven't yet. So
For the listeners out there, if you have heard of this option being successfully implemented, love to get some feedback from ET Nation here on that and provide some insights. Because I'm thinking some of the challenges around this requirement might go like this, where your utility, you've got an existing impoundment or landfill going, and it's been being used. It's not full yet, but now you might have to implement this type of system. But okay, I don't have a lot of land available to do a transfer of material, so I can design the landfill that I need to put in place to take the material and swap it out, so to speak. I gotta imagine that kind of evaluations going on at some of these utilities. And then where does that make sense as far as breaking even, or even not even breaking even, just managing it properly within the rule? I think that's a big challenge.
And I think one of the things that I've seen that has been successful is doing what's called a consolidation and capping.
Okay.
Some of these surface impoundments or these smaller landfills that are in that state that you've talked about there, I've seen utilities that have gone in and realized that they may not have the acreage, but they have the airspace available, right? So if they were to take some of this stuff and move it for a little bit to where they could put down a liner system and then just
Peel
stack
back
everything
over.
over here, over
Yep.
there. It's really consolidating down the footprint. That's allowed under the rule because that's basically a lined unit. You could do that. You could remove the material out, re-prepare the subgrade, put your liner down, and then make yourself a. And it's still moving material, but it's not sending it off-site for disposal. It's not building a whole new 50-acre facility for it. You're consolidating that footprint. You're working with your engineers to get it to be stable at a certain height, and
Right.
you're working with your local state and making sure that you're in compliance with any permits you might have with them as far as your airspace requirements on those landfills. So I think that's an option that is being successfully implemented in parts of the utility world right now. And we've actually had one site that did that here in Tennessee as well, where they did a consolidation and capping, and they've seen the groundwater improve. They've seen all of these things happen that they wanted to see happen, but they didn't have to go through a big construction project to do it.
I think one of the big questions we're talking about CCR and the management of it, the biggest, I think, impact into the rule now, though, has been the beneficial reuse options, right? And not that people weren't probably doing it already in the past before the rule was actually finalized and put out, but there are new criteria for what's considered beneficial reuse. Maybe you could talk about the two categories of what's considered beneficial reuse or disposal versus that. And then what are the four criteria that must be met when it's not considered disposal?
Beneficial reuse of CCR has been going on as long as there's been a
Coal ash
market.
probably.
Yeah, almost right. It's a fly ash is great for strengthening concrete. Part of the scrubbers, whenever you're doing what they call FGD, flue gas desulfurization, one of the things you end up with out of some of these units is real high quality gypsum that is great for wallboard. It's good as a soil amendment. It can be used in the cement manufacturing process. There's all these great uses that are in industry. You can use some of the bottom slag material to make shingles out of. There's all this great stuff that it's been used for years. And it was a piecemeal, right? It was up to the states to basically determine how material is properly or improperly going to be beneficially or used, whatever it might be. But the federal government broke it down into two things: whether you're going to basically be doing encapsulated beneficial reuse or you're going to be doing unencapsulated beneficial reuse. And encapsulated is where you're going to bind that CCR material into a final product. That's where you take gypsum and you make it into wallboard. That's where you take fly ash and you add it to concrete. It binds it into a matrix. It effectively renders it inert and not going to be distributed to the environment in the future.
Right.
If you're doing encapsulated beneficial reuse, you've got a lot more options and freedoms and less restrictions on what you're going to do. But if you're going to be doing unencapsulated, if you're going to be using it as a fill material or a structural fill under a road bed, you have to do a little bit more to make sure that you're not going to have any impacts on the environment. Because what we don't want to do is take a material that's sitting in an open environment here, causing a problem, and then use it again in another open environment and still continue to cause a condition of pollution or something like that. You have those two ways, but regardless of which way you're going, you've got to, number one, show that what you're doing is substituting for a virgin material. EPA wants you to be able to say, we are using gypsum from this plant instead of going out and mining gypsum from the earth.
Yeah.
We're taking a product that we would go out and harvest from the environment, and instead we're going to use this material to substitute for it. We're also it's going to have design standards and product specifications to it, right? It's not just going to be something that, oh yeah, we're burning more coal ash to make. Yeah, it's going to go into a specified product. It's going to have a design criteria and it's going to have
Right.
specifications. And then it's also, whenever you're going to do it in a unencapsulated situation, you want to make sure that you're not using or stockpiling more than around 12,000 tons of this material at any given place. We don't want people just moving material from one location to the other and not using it. You've got to make sure you're not causing a condition of pollution. And you look at the same location restrictions, and this is all a beneficial reuse outside of roadway. Roadway reuse is exempt from these requirements. But
Oh, okay.
if you're going to use it as a structural fill, or if you're going to use it, maybe fill up an old quarry, something like that, there's a lot of different things that folks do with it. You've got to demonstrate that it's not going to cause impacts to groundwater. You don't have any wetlands. You're not doing it in a structurally unstable
Right.
zone. It's
Yeah.
not prone to flooding. All of these things are limiting that. But if you do this unencapsulated beneficial reuse or encapsulated beneficial reuse, I strongly encourage you to work with your local state regulators. Here in Tennessee, you would work with our Division of Solid Waste Management. You have to do what's called a beneficial use determination, what we ask from those folks that want to beneficially reuse any type of waste, but CR is definitely that same process.
So they have to get approval,
Yeah, they
right,
will.
to actually use the material in some beneficial reuse way. And the TDEC or other utility regulators need to know ahead of time for that facility, that location, what the intended use is that material.
And we're going to require you to do record keeping. We're going to require you to let us know where it's going, what it's being used for.
Right.
Check all those particular boxes to make sure that whatever you're doing with it meets our standard, meets the federal standard, and that it doesn't just, we're not wanting beneficial reuse to be disposal under a different name. You don't want it to be, I'm taking out of the surface impoundment and I'm filling up a hole over here on the property next door. That really doesn't change the condition, right? If you're not doing a liner, if you're not doing something like that, you're still taking it from an open environment and putting it into an open environment. You don't really change what the material is or what it's doing. So you got to show that it changes the characteristics of the material and that it truly does substitute for something else that could be used.
I think if I was the utility, I'm just looking at this as a huge revenue stream then, right? Isn't this a major revenue stream for the utilities as well?
Absolutely. There's actually a facility here in Tennessee where there is a wallboard plant literally built right next door to the power plant, because they basically take the gypsum as it comes out of the scrubbers, goes straight over and becomes wallboard next door.
Yeah.
That company pays for that product. They don't pay as high a premium for it because they're helping out the utility, but it's offsetting the cost of, number one, managing that material long term and disposal sense, the cost associated with that. You're lowering those costs, and then you're generating a little bit of revenue, right? And for the fly ash and concrete, there is nothing better for strengthening concrete. Cement doesn't do as well as fly ash does. Portland cement does not. It is a premium product for that, and there's a definite market for it. And as I said when we started the show, we're not building new coal-fired power plants. We're closing them down. So where are we going to get this great fly ash if it's not coming out of the stacks anymore for concrete? Where are we going to get this great gypsum if we're not burning coal to generate it? We've got to look at going to the landfills where we've disposed of this material and getting that material out and getting it into a beneficial use.
Yeah, I got to imagine too. This approach is really hitting a lot of sustainability buttons too. We're recycling, we're reusing, we're not going back, and we're saving all of the greenhouse gas impacts of mining a new product. This is, I think, a huge win for the utilities that I'm not sure they're talking it up enough to the public and reporting and things like that around how important this aspect of their business is to the environment.
Oh, absolutely. And I work on a regular basis with the local concrete folks here in Tennessee, and I meet with them every couple of months to see how things are going. And one of the things they keep saying to me is that we're trying to advertise how if you use fly ash in concrete, not only is it better for the concrete, but it can actually help you with your carbon footprint on your construction project. If you're looking for that type of, if you're doing a LEED certification or green building certification, that kind of stuff, this actually is a positive. By using fly ash in concrete, it is a positive for that. So there's kind of those intangibles. And I think one of the challenges there is not only getting those kind of folks to realize that this material is a great material for the beneficial use, but finding a way to quantify that, finding a way to track that. And I encourage the folks listening to think about that. There's already market there for the material, but I think there's definitely a market there for trying to figure out how to quantify how much greenhouse gas emissions,
Impact
carbon
reduction
reduction.
is happening,
All
right?
that.
Absolutely. I know, like, we have an advisory arm that's working in sustainability, with a sustainability practice. And I know that we're probably doing this exact same thing for a lot of our utility clients, because that's exactly what they need to know and how to communicate that to their investors or stockholders, their leadership. I think it's real important. When you talk about some of these impacts and things like that, we've talked about beneficial reuse, which is great. And having a sister, maybe even or a company that's like a partner with you as a utility that can take this material, that is, probably an ideal situation, especially if they're going to be working for a long time and still operating for a while. But when you look at some of the other challenges to the rule, maybe we could talk a little bit about the groundwater monitoring corrective action and requirements, because I think there's a little bit of an onerous heavy lift in that space too for some of these utilities. It's not like it's, hey, I just sample one time, go out and figure it out, and then we're good. No, it's a constant monitoring program, from what I understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. The federal CCR rule is going to make you characterize groundwater under each one of your units. And it's going to be, what do you have flowing in? What's your background concentrations? What do you have down gradient? And they're not very prescriptive on it, right? They say you need to have up gradient wells, you need to have down gradient wells, and you need to properly characterize groundwater and determine if there are impacts. And that requires a pretty robust monitoring program. It starts off with quarterly sampling. And then if you have any statistical exceedances, you move into the corrective action phase of it and determining if you have any of your high constituents of concerns that pose a risk to human health and the environment. You have and groundwater is probably the biggest media that's impacted with CCR management, right? These units are usually constructed in areas adjacent surface water bodies where the water table is shallower. As I said, a lot of them are unlined. There's a lot of interaction between the material and the leachate and the environment. So you have to spend a lot of time characterizing that groundwater, determining where your constituents of concerns are, expanding your well networks as you identify them, right? You start off with a basic one with maybe one up gradient well and three down gradient wells, and the next thing you've got 4 up gradient wells and 12 down gradient wells, trying to determine what your extent of impacts
Yeah,
are.
the
And
influence
what
of
and
groundwater.
yeah, and once you've found it, then you've got to go, okay, these are the impacts we have. This is where they're at. How are we going to treat them? What is our corrective action? Are we going to install a pump and treat system? Can we do some type of in situ treatment of this for the metals? Can we close this unit in a way that's going to stop it from being a
Leaching.
contributing factor to it, right? Leachating and getting that leachate into the groundwater. So you have to assess all of those. And then you have to think of, ultimately, do we have any drinking water nearby, right? Do people
Yeah.
use this groundwater as a drinking water resource? Do we have a significant nexus to a surface water body where we might be impacting that? So we've got to assess that as well. So it's very complex. It has to be done in a pretty short amount of time, too. The federal rule doesn't give you decades to figure out if you have a groundwater problem, right? They want you to find out early if you are impacting groundwater. They want you to come up with a corrective action on it as quickly as you possibly can, get it implemented, and get those groundwater constituents down to those MCLs to where you're not having any impacts. And it is, when you look at some power providers where they might have 5, 6, 7, 8 plants where they've got multiple units at, that starts to be a big effort to put
Yeah,
that
that's
many
yeah,
wells
yeah.
in.
I can't imagine some of the bigger utilities out there who span multiple states. There's lots of legacy impoundments. There's current active impoundments. This is a big program for a lot of those utilities, I know.
And they really want you to characterize the groundwater from, like, top to bottom. They don't want you
Yep.
to just put a shallow well in.
Oh yeah,
They
you need
Yeah,
to you
you've
need
gotta
to,
profile it,
define the entire aquifer,
Yeah,
the zone hydrogeologically. Absolutely.
yeah,
You absolutely have to
yeah,
do that. And that's
yeah.
great. So I just wanted to figure if we talk a little bit about that. And then of course there's ongoing obligations of monitoring, and you got to
Right,
keep that up just to make sure that nothing is leaking, even though it doesn't appear to be leaking
right.
now. Right. So it's
Right. And you've got to update that every year under the federal rule. You've got to basically do a statistical update every year that shows that you are not impacting groundwater. And you're going to have to do that for the life of whether it's an active unit or it's a closed unit for a certain amount of time. It's usually 30-year post closure, very consistent with RECRA regulations in that respect. So you have to realize that it's not only an investment now, but it's going to be an ongoing investment throughout the process. If you have impacts to the environment that have to be addressed, that extends the timelines of monitoring even more. You have to demonstrate before you can get out of what they call that corrective action assessment kind of loop there. You've got to demonstrate that what you did improved the quality of groundwater. So it's going to be a process.
long-term
And
process too.
yeah, long
Yeah.
term. And a lot of people think 30 years isn't a long time, but that's a long time to be
That's all.
operating a groundwater monitoring system.
That's a
That's
long
a long
time,
time.
at least. Oh my goodness. I think that, yeah, a lot of that work's going to have to take place. And it's interesting that I'm sure there's some modeling that's going to take place too, as well. So I know we do a lot of modeling where you 3D visualization, just really seeing the impact. How many landfills that are out there have already been properly closed to this new standard? I can't imagine there's been that many because the rule just came out really recently. And so a couple years ago, has there been any closed landfills that were designed the proper way? according to the rules?
I'll use Tennessee as an example because we do have landfills that currently meet the compliance standard of the federal CCR rule, and
Okay.
they're active. They're still being used. They are very similar. They're RECRA Subtitle D landfills, basically, with liner system, leachate collection, run on, run off control, everything you
Yeah.
have to have. So we do have those landfills that exist, of course, and when they go into closure, they will have the composite cap system associated with it, everything else. But there are a lot of landfills that were closed without that in many states, including Tennessee. Back in the early days of RECRA programs and stuff like that, they might have closed them with a soil cap only. They may not have done a composite cap system on the top of it. So but really, it started happening probably post Kingston, prior to the 2015 rule. People started, when they did think about building a new CCR landfill, they started building it uh,
Appropriate. Yeah.
up to
With a liner.
appropriate standards. So a lot of the ones that are active now that were built in the last decade or so are going to be compliant with RECRA and compliant with the federal CCR rule. But there's landfills that have been in operation for 20, 30 years that may or may not be in compliance with them.
You got to
Yeah.
think all those landfills are potential gold mines, so to speak, of revenue if they had the right partner.
Yeah, and what we like to call, the term I like to throw around is closure by harvesting. I
Yeah.
want there to be a third option for
Right.
CCR. We have closure by removal, we have closure in place. I want closure by harvesting to
Yeah.
be
Pull
one.
it out of there.
I want us to be able to close these units in a way that we can go back and get this resource once the market, because it's a market driven resource, right?
Yeah.
It it's cost a little more to get it out of the landfill than it did to just take it off the stack and send it to the neighbor next door. So being conscious of what the future potential in the market is and making sure that when we do close, of course, any closure we do will be protective of the environment, but we want to do it in such a way that if the regulated entity wants to go back in there and harvest that material, when the market will pay that much for it, which of course at some point it will, right?
Yeah.
Markets change, markets shift. So I think we want to be conscious of when we do a closure of making sure we can go back in there, the regulated entity, TVA, can go back in there and harvest that material for beneficial reuse if it's
Any
suitable for it.
any projects that you're working on now where harvesting is happening? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, TVA is actually harvesting out of two of their landfills here in Tennessee for gypsum. They are both permitted landfills. They're both class 2 landfills here in Tennessee. They had to go through a very extensive regulatory process to get it approved by TDEC to do this. But they're basically going into these old gypsum disposal units that have been sitting out there for decades, and they're digging this material up. They're sending it to the wallboard either next door, or they're putting it on trucks and sending it to another wallboard plant down the road, because the demand is so high for that material that what they're producing out of the stacks isn't keeping up. And this material, there's been foresight in how they disposed of it. Most of the time they separate their gypsum from their fly ash. And so we can go back in there and really get this gypsum material back out into the market. They did have to go through a pretty extensive process. It required a modification to their permit because these are all permitted units. And it was a learning process for both TDEC and TVA on that one.
Yep.
But we were able to come up with some specific design criteria, specific processing, all of this stuff had to be demonstrated to our satisfaction that it was going to be done safely, effectively, and protective of the environment. And TVA did a great job doing that. And now I throw out a number, I'm not 100% on that, but I think from what I understand, they are currently, based on the amount of ash they produce out of these plants, gypsum, they are recycling over 100% of it, because they're not only taking what's coming out
They're
of the stack,
harvesting what's in
but
the
they're
landfill.
harvesting. So they're taking out more than they're putting into the landfills right now, which is great.
That's a great success story for that project. That's fantastic. I'd be interested to see or hear from the listeners if there are other projects like that that are going on, and maybe some of the success stories around that, and maybe the partnerships that have been developed. We haven't really talked about the contractor slash remedial contractor slash gypsum wallboard or concrete partnerships and how that all works. I'm sure maybe there are brokers just for managing. I'm pretty sure there's like broker groups for this type of stuff too.
Yeah, there are marketers, right? There are folks that what they do is they work with utilities to get this material out into the market.
Yeah.
Most utilities are not set up to be a marketer of a material, right?
Yeah.
It's not their business model. But
Right.
there are companies that do that and that they go out there, they identify where they can sell this material at, they identify how they're going to get it there. They're the logistics and sales component
Yeah.
of that process. And it's a
Right.
great, and I also look at your regulator as a partner in this process too. The states are going to want to work with you guys. The regulators are going to want to work with you guys to come up with ways to, within the confines of the rules and the regulations, implement these projects and get them done
That's,
safely. And so I think it's like you said, it's a series of partnerships, right? From the folks that are out there finding the market for it and selling it and getting it there logistically, to the folks that are generating it and excavating it and sending it that way, and to the regulators who are making sure it's being done within the confines of the regs.
if anybody who's listening to the podcast would like to come on the show and talk about kind of the brokering aspect of this CCR industry, feel free to reach out. I'd love to bring you on and talk about it. I think that'd be a great topic as well, because it's just another piece of solving the problems that the CCR presents in the industry and supporting the rules. So I think it's really good.
Absolutely, absolutely. And especially if you know that y'all are doing some great work out there, I love to hear the success stories, and I like to learn from other people. I want to hear what's working, what's not working, and how it can be improved upon as we start going through this. 2015 was 9 years ago. That's not very long for regulatory programs to be in place. So we're still learning, we're still developing, and we definitely need the feedback from the professional community on how it
Yeah.
could be done better. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Rob, thanks for coming on to the show. It's been a great conversation, very enlightening on some of the aspects of CCR and the new rule updates and the challenges I think a lot of utilities and regulators are facing dealing with this material. But I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot of success there. There's a lot of great opportunity to improve sustainability and put products back into the industry through reuse. And I think it's a great story. So thanks for coming on the show and really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Thanks for listening and watching the show. If you enjoyed the show, then please share it with your friends and coworkers on social media and tell somebody in person. Thanks for being with us, ET Nation.